Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Reflections on the Lesser Ritual of the Hexagram, Part 1, Method and Genealogy. The full text of the ritual is included in the description box below. At first glance, from a Thelemic neo-pagan perspective, the Christian-derived symbolism of the Lesser Ritual of the Hexagram, henceforth abbreviated LRH, can appear unappealing or simply irrelevant in the post-Christian context of the new eon, due to the ritual's reliance on the old eon feudal agrarian mythology of the dying and rising god, whether this be Osiris, Attis, Adonis, or the Christ, in contrast to the scientific and techno-Gnostic attitude, more characteristic of the modern practitioner of the magical arts. While acknowledging the appropriateness of this judgment in its broadest strokes, it will nevertheless be my project in the following commentary to show how the historical context from which the ritual emerges, that of the so-called Rosicrucian Enlightenment and its esoteric successors, including the Inner Order of the Golden Dawn, while emerging from a Christian cultural context, nevertheless directly anticipate and support the philosophical position in the new eon. Hermeneutically engaged with in this light, the magical significance of the ritual is by no means limited to the framework of explicitly Christian theology and can potentially be of primary usefulness for Thelemites. The methodology underlying these reflections instantiates the motto, "Always historicize," promulgated by the American Marxist cultural critic Frederick Jameson. Along these lines, I approach the reading of the ritual, as well as the texts and traditions that gave rise to it, in the spirit of the phenomenological epoche, or constructively skeptical bracketing of experience, by avoiding essentializing pre-assumptions of what Christianity either is or is not supposed to mean or consist of. Instead, my goal is to remain open to understanding the ritual's significance through bringing into dialogue what its symbolic components meant in the past with what they might mean for us today. Following this procedure, it is possible to ontogenetically recapitulate the temporal emergence of Thelema as a version of modernist post-Christian esotericism by charting the passage of its genealogy through and thereby eventually out of a Christian cultural context, thereby framing the larger picture of how Thelema is both reacting against and at the same time creatively reinterpreting otherwise Christian symbolism to arrive at and articulate its own historically innovative position. My intention is to stage what Martin Heidegger calls a hermeneutical repetition, or Wiederholung, a concept that comes originally from Kierkegaard, who wrote a novella with this title, Repetition, where it refers to how subjectivity becomes spirit by being transformed through religious faith. Heidegger secularizes Kierkegaard's implicitly Gnostic idea, separating the notion of a spiritual repetition from the context of Christian dogmatics, using it to instead emphasize the historical ontology of human existence apart from any kind of supernatural determination or naive appeal to a context-independent notion of objective truth. In other words, how human beings, famously called Dasein, or being there by Heidegger, practically relate to themselves within the context of a set of historical circumstances, establishes the interpretive or hermeneutical horizon that defines who and what they are. Likewise, when human beings retroactively examine and judge their past actions, they are not bound by the self-understanding of previous agents, and may reinterpret the meaning of their actions, thereby possibly changing who and what they were. In this sense, what is past is not fixed, at least in terms of its meaning, and its significance can be changed in the future. In these circumstances, a repetition, in the special hermeneutical sense meant here, is a kind of interpretation where a text, defined in the broadest sense as any object of interpretation, is understood in such a way that its potentialities for being are disclosed that were implicit in its earlier interpretation and yet not previously fully developed. For example, the Oedipal subtext of Shakespeare's Hamlet was always implicit to the narrative structure of the play, yet this content could only be made explicit after Freud's psychoanalytic theory gained preeminence in the 20th century. Previously, Hamlet was classed as one of Shakespeare's problem plays, where the character's inexplicable yet somehow deeply dramatically appropriate inaction remained a mystery for critics. It served as an issue which created cathartic tension, yet which is not resolvable at the level of the character's directly represented motivation, thus heightening the dramatic tension. After Freud, the meaning of the play has changed for audiences, and with it the play itself is therefore in some virtually real sense different, even while its text remains identical to that which was performed in the past. Applied to a thelemic magical context, I interpret the perspective of the new eon as a hermeneutical repetition of the Western, that is to say, Northwestern European and Latin Christian, esoteric tradition that retroactively changes the meaning that its symbolism bore in the old eon, at least for those subjects who are participants of the new. There, of course, continue to be persons of conventional Christian faith involved in the Rosicrucian and Golden Dawn traditions, for whom the symbolism of the LRH still retains something of its old eon significance. Some members of Paul Foster Case's Builders of the Adytum come to mind as an example. Such individuals are excluded without prejudice from the present context of the following specifically thelemic exegesis. However, to fully explicate the contours of the thelemic repetition of the Christian-derived symbolism of the LRH, the historical genealogy of the ritual first needs to be carefully examined and analyzed to identify and define the nature of the constructive break with Christianity, instantiated by its thelemic usage, such that the deeply Gnostic import of this reinterpretation can be more fully comprehended by its contemporary thelemic practitioners. The lesser ritual of the hexagram was originally issued to initiates of, and is therefore implicitly a commentary on, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn's Adeptus Minor 5=6 initiation, corresponding to the Sephira Tifereth at the center of the Tree of Life, and granting admittance to the Golden Dawn's inner or second order, the Order Rusae, Rubea et Aurorae Crucis, typically abbreviated as the RRAC, and translatable as the Order of the Ruby Rose and Golden Cross. As the name indicates, the most obvious feature of the 5=6 initiation is its theatrical narration of the myth of Christian Rosencreutz. In the Rosicrucian magical order, he allegedly founded based on the text of the Fama Fraternitatis, the first of the so-called Rosicrucian manifestos. The interpretation of the LRH should therefore begin with an understanding of this text, first published in 1614, although it was written earlier and likely circulated in manuscript. By clarifying the historical hermeneutical horizon of the text of the Fama and its associated documents, including the Confessio Fraternitatis and the chemical wedding of Christian Rosencreutz, it becomes possible to understand how the thelemic interpretation of these traditions relates to, and it also differs from, that of their initially Christian authors. In other words, through first answering the question of what the Fama meant in the past, will it then become clear how to interpret the text in the present. The primary historical context of the Rosicrucian writings is the onset of what can today retroactively be characterized as modernity, defined as the displacement of the traditional agrarian, feudal, and organic hierarchical structuring of society with an industrialized, capitalist, and individualistic organization of global culture. Several events in the earliest phases of the development of modern society overlap to bring about the circumstances to which the Rosicrucian writings are a response. These included the discovery of the so-called New World by Europeans in 1492 and its subsequent colonial conquest, the revival of the arts and humanities during the Renaissance in the Italian states, as well as the Reformation, which broke up the previously broadly unified Latin Christian communion into violently competing Protestant and Roman Catholic political power blocs. By the beginning of the 17th century, the Protestant nations were concentrated in northern and western Europe, including England, Sweden, and the United Provinces of the Netherlands. Meanwhile, the major Catholic powers were France, ruled by the Bourbon dynasty, and their bitter rivals, the Habsburg family, which ruled both the Spanish and Austrian empires. In Central Europe, these divisions were acutely felt, as the German-speaking territories of the Holy Roman Empire were internally divided into rival confessional zones of allegiance. Within this profoundly revolutionary context, one of the central themes of the Fama is its prophetic annunciation of a general reformation. But what exactly did this phrase mean for its original readers? The phrase general reformation does not initially derive from the Fama, but from the larger context of Western European humanism. Humanism originates in the medieval period as represented by figures such as Petrarch and Dante, and is characterized by enthusiasm for ancient pagan learning. The major figure of the revival of humanism, overlapping with and informing the Reformation, was Desiderius Erasmus, 1466 to 1536, whose scholarly Greek edition of the New Testament was used by Luther and the Reformers, yet who distanced himself from the partisan conflict his work influenced, advocating for toleration and dialogue between theologically opposed partisans. As typified by Erasmus, the humanist tradition moving forward in early modernity is frequently characterized by an attitude of intellectual openness and toleration that contrasts with and garnered the hostility of both the Catholics as well as the emergent Protestant orthodoxy, of which the Calvinist Puritans were the most outspoken heresy hunters. Within this milieu, humanism, and especially the Hermetic magical tradition of humanism, which the Rosicrucian manifestos are an expression, constitutes a philosophical and political third way, attempting to mediate and diffuse the religious violence of its times through the promotion of a loosely Christianized pagan wisdom, and particularly magical spirituality, as an alternative to Christian dogmatism. The original printing of the Fama in Kassel, a city in Hesse, a part of the German-speaking territory of the Holy Roman Empire in Central Europe, prefaced the text of the first Rosicrucian manifesto with an excerpt from the Italian humanist Trianano Boccalini's Ragu Agli de Parnasso, Advertisements from Parnassus, on the theme of a proposed general reformation of the world to follow and complete the Protestant version of the same. At this time, the Habsburg-ruled Spanish Imperium had militarily occupied the Italian states, leading to a suppression of the Renaissance in southern Europe, which consequently moved north into the relatively more tolerant Protestant territories not under Catholic dominion. Boccalini's text, as cited in the first publication of the Fama, features a speech by Apollo, the god of artistic learning, magic, and oracles, decrying the oppression of the Italian states by the Habsburg reactionaries and the failure of the Council of Trent, not directly named while obviously being the contextual point of reference, to overcome the confusion produced by the Protestants through the promulgation of a general reformation of the whole world based on charity and neighborly love. The Council of Trent from 1545 to 1563 was a committee of Roman Catholic bishops convened to oversee the internal reform of the Catholic Church in response to the criticisms of the Protestant Reformation. They clarified Catholic belief and formulated the doctrinal basis for post-medieval Catholicism, but were not successful in politically reunited Latin Christendom. Instead, their proclamations initiated and justified the phase of militant Catholic reaction known as the Counter-Reformation. Advertisements from Parnassus is an example of a ludibrium, meaning an ironic, dramatic fiction. Johann Valentine Andrea, 1586 to 1654, the author of The Chemical Wedding, and either the author, co-author, or collaborator with the authors of the Fama and Confessio, describes the Rosicrucian writings as a ludibrium in several of his own writings. Taking these remarks as a clue, it becomes possible to identify the literary genre of which the manifestos are part. In the context of the early 17th century, this genre broadly includes satirical, political, and theological dialogues such as Giordano Bruno's Ash Wednesday Supper, and the anti-papal Expulsion of the Triumphant Beast, as well as utopian allegories such as Thomas More's Utopia, Tommaso Campanella's City of the Sun, and Christianopolis, a similar utopian allegory written by Andrea later in his career. Crucially, Andrea's concept of this genre would also include theatrical comedies such as Shakespeare's The Tempest. The term comedy, used as a synonym for ludubrium, is technically correct, but too limited if defined by today's popular use of the word. In early modernity, comedy is a broader genre concept, not solely limited to the staging of humor for its own sake. It would be better to qualify the definition by saying that ludubria are comedies in the sense that they are characterized by the ironic use of dramatic allegory, meaning that the scenarios they depict are not to be taken literally, even while they metaphorically allude to an often quite serious philosophical, political, and theological statement of position. The implication is that insofar as the Fama Fraternitatis is a ludubrium, as its probable author claimed it was, it should likewise be read as an allegory, and not as a literal description of an actual person or organization. What then is the Fama an allegory of? As the text tells us, it is an allegory calling for a general reformation to bring about a new golden age of learning, based on the humanist recovery and application of ancient magical wisdom as a third way, avoiding the extremes of both Catholic reaction and vulgar exoteric Protestantism, which is, with its counterproductive tendency towards anti-intellectualism and the rejection of humanist learning. Based as it is on ancient pagan wisdom, the Hermeticism espoused by the Rosicrucian writings is nominally, not essentially, Christian. Its gnosis is an esoteric kernel that can take on the covering of whatever exoteric religious context it finds itself within, just as it can flourish under the conditions of post-religious secularism, as it does today. The originally pagan theurgic tradition influenced spiritual traditions in all three major monotheistic religions that came to dominate the medieval period, whether Jewish Kabbalah, Christian mysticism, or Islamic Sufism. The Christ of the Rosicrucian manifestos is therefore best characterized as the alchemical Christ, whose death and resurrection symbolize the spiritual regeneration of the soul, represented in the text by the figure of Christian Rosencreutz, who is the archetype of the magical practitioner, redeemed and empowered by gnosis, above and beyond the salvation offered by merely exoteric religious faith. In the context of the Christian Renaissance, Frances Yates, in her influential 1969 work, Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition, identified the Florentine Marsilio Ficino's revival of Hermeticism as the esoteric side of the humanist revival in the Italian states. Spreading with the influence of the New Learning, Bohemia, Elizabethan England, and Heidelberg in the Palatine state became centers of an early modern Hermetic subculture, giving rise to prominent patrons and practitioners of the magical arts, such as John Dee, the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, Michael Beyer, Robert Flood, Jacob Burma, and the circle of intellectuals that produced the Rosicrucian writings. Crushed by the 30 Years' War in Central Europe and the Puritan Revolution in England, the renewal of intra-Christian confessional warfare in the first half of the 17th century forced the gnosis to go underground until it could reemerge under the conditions of secularization created by the Enlightenment and the emergence of bourgeois culture in the 18th and 19th centuries. As Europe's colonial empires conquered and exploited the world, the resulting rise of industrialized capitalism eventually undermined Christian hegemony, allowing alternative cultural options to develop. Fast forward into the end of the Victorian era, in the wake of several serious attempts in a Masonic and theosophical context to revive a transmittable system of practical occultism, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn finally succeeded in robustly reconstructing the Hermetic magical body of knowledge and practice that had been previously recovered and lost during the Renaissance. In the initiatory rites and rituals of the Golden Dawn's 5=6 grade, the Rosicrucian mythology serves to organize the themes performatively actualized by the lesser ritual of the hexagram, a magical working designed to combine with the lesser ritual of the pentagram taught in the Golden Dawn's outer order. If the pentagram represents the equilibrated microcosm, the lesser cosmos of the human world, whose perfecting discloses the hexagram in the column at the climax of the LRP, then the LRH now further analyzes the symbolism of the hexagram as a sign of the macrocosm, the greater cosmos of the planetary system centered in the sun, whose unification with the microcosm is facilitated by the formula of the hexagram ritual, as represented by the interlocking of the two triangles that form the figure. The Christ who appears in the analysis is therefore the alchemical Christ of the Rosicrucian manifestos, not to be confused or conflated with the historical Jesus, faith in whom grants salvation in a traditional Pauline Christian context. In contrast, the Gnostic initiate undergoes an identification of themselves with the God form, the dying and rising divinity of whom Christ and Osiris are both mythological types. Rather than worshiping the Christ as an external and therefore exoteric Savior, whose death and resurrection sacrificially atones for the ethical transgressions of the worshipper, the Golden Dawn and Thelemic magician themselves directly become the Christ, undergoing the process of what Carl Jung calls archetype possession. By doing so, they discover their identity with the divine, where they are simultaneously the worshipper and the worshipped. From this standpoint, they can take full responsibility for their own social behavior without the need to be saved by an outside agency. This understanding is an esoteric gnosis that exceeds the bounds of traditional religious orthodoxy, which can then be discarded or pragmatically preserved, depending on the contextual needs of the magician. Pistis, or faith as allegiance to the messianic status of the historical Jesus, has no necessary relationship with what's going on in the LRH. The magical theory underlying the unification of the microcosm and macrocosm, symbolized by the hexagram in the LRH, historically derives from the cosmological worldview of Renaissance magic. Similar to and compatible with the system of the four Kabbalistic worlds are the three worlds posited by early modern Hermetic philosophy: terrestrial, astral, and supercelestial. The terrestrial world is that of the Earth and its surrounding vaporous aerial envelope, corresponding to Asaya. The substance of this world is composed of the four elements, which are animated and set in motion through their reception of influences from the higher worlds. Surrounding the world is the astral world of interplanetary space, which was understood as being pervaded by a subtle fluidic substance called the ether. The astral world is equivalent to Yetzirah in the four worlds model. Finally, in both the standard versions of the Ptolemaic and Copernican cosmological models, the solar system is surrounded by the celestial sphere of the fixed stars, demarcating the boundary of the physical cosmos, beyond which is the purely noetic, meaning mental or intellectual, divine domain outside of space and time. This is the supercelestial world, mapping to Bria and Atziluth, including the stars of the celestial sphere, especially the 12 signs of the zodiac with its further subdivision into 36 decans, which serve to magically manifest the archetypal spiritual forms of the divine realm with the material cosmos. According to the standard textbooks of Renaissance magic, Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, the magical arts can be divided into 3 ascending categories, corresponding to the to the 3 worlds: natural, mathematical, and theological. The charms and filters of natural magic are associated with the terrestrial world of the 4 elements. Mathematical magic, typified by astral talismans constructed from number squares, relates to the astral domain of the planetary spheres. Finally, the theurgic workings of theological magic to invoke and converse with angels, including the personal daimon, correspond to the supercelestial or supernatural domain beyond the sphere of the fixed stars of the Ptolemaic cosmology, traditionally interacted with through the 36 decans or 10-degree subdivisions of the zodiac and the related memory palace images as set forth in the Picatrix. An alternative version of this threefold division appears in John Dee and Edward Kelly's Enochian system of magic, as the distinction between the 4 elemental watchtowers, natural and terrestrial, the heptarchic structure of planetary angels, depicted by the Sigillum de Emeth, mathematical and astral, and the 30 ethers, theological supercelestial. Golden Dawn and Thelemic magicians will also be familiar with this division as it appears on the Tree of Life as the distinction between the three orders or colleges of the Golden Dawn, Rose Cross, and Silver Star, respectively correlated to the elemental, planetary, and zodiacal symbol sets, corresponding to Malkut, the planetary Sephiroth, and the Supernals. In Renaissance magic, the astral influences of the planets and stars pertaining to the middle region of the celestial cosmos serve to mediate between the supercelestial or intellectual realms of the pure forms and the lower world of the terrestrial elements, which receive the imprint of the divine forms through the astrological effluvia, like how hot wax receives the imprint of a seal. Both the creation of the universe as well as the operations of natural magic are effectuated by the medium of the soul of the world, which suffuses the cosmos just as the human soul suffuses the body. This likeness means that the human being has a homologous structure as the cosmos, as above, so below, in accord with the Hermetic axiom of the Emerald Tablet. Agrippa explains, quote, "There is therefore such a kind of spirit required to be, as it were, the medium, whereby celestial souls are joined to gross bodies, and bestow upon them wonderful gifts. This spirit is after the same manner in the body of man. For as the powers of our soul are communicated to the members of the body by the spirit, so also the virtue of the soul of the world is diffused through all things by quintessence." Unquote. According to Robert Flood, Agrippa's threefold division of the macrocosm into the supercelestial realm of forms, the astral intermediary domain, and the terrestrial world is reflected in the microcosm of the human person as the tripart distinction of mental functions into ratio, intellectus, and mens, or in English, the sensibility, imagination, and reason. Corresponding to the astral world is the human imagination, which gives form to ideas just as the world soul does, facilitating communication between the divine unity and the everyday ego self and its world of experience. This is the reason why in 19th century theosophy, the visionary inner space projected within the imagination is called the astral plane. This correspondence between the astral world of the cosmos, permeated by the world soul, and the psychological faculty of the imagination, with its ability to project archetypal images, permits Renaissance magic and its obviously superseded cosmology to be updated for practical use in the present. This is accomplished through a simple yet profound inversion. Rather than the parts of the soul being viewed as projections of cosmic planetary energies that derive their meaning from an otherworldly supernatural domain, instead the signifier set of the planets, with all their rich traditional mythological associations intact, can be understood as symbols of aspects of the psyche. As a result of this shift in perspective, the human person more explicitly becomes the locus of the divine, the ultimate source of the archetypal symbols which are projected upon the available neutral medium of experience, like the images glimpsed in a Rorschach ink blot. Spiritual transcendence is immanently expressed by the ontology of our human mode of existence, not located in another world. Interpreted by way of such a hermeneutical repetition, the symbol of the hexagram used in the Golden Dawn's LRH affects the geometrical semiotic unification of the planetary symbol set in order to facilitate the communication between the human and the divine through the mediation of the imagination. In other words, by symbolizing the unification of the psyche and the imagination, the actual unification of the self is invoked. This is possible because the psyche is inherently already the locus of the divine, defined as the self-disclosure of the self-mediated being, imbued with ultimate meaning and purpose. And what else could this be in a thelemic context than our own human existence? Regardless of its scientific supersession, the three worlds model of Renaissance magic nevertheless provides a valuable resource to symbolize our innate divinity to ourselves, because of its deep historical affinities to the semiotic system of the magical language of correspondences of the Kabbalistic Tree of Life. Therefore, although the LRH is centered upon the astral planetary world, it nevertheless uses the four elemental forms of the hexagram, inscribed with the four fixed zodiacal signs that correspond to these elements. This is because, according to the three worlds model, the equilibration of the astral world of the planets facilitates communication and spiritual alignment between the terrestrial and supercelestial worlds of the human and the divine. The placement of the elemental hexagram forms at the four quarters of the heavens symbolizes the ideal reception by the terrestrial elements, their corresponding spiritual influences emanating from the celestial sphere, thereby affirming the equilibration of all three worlds affected through the theurgic illumination of the magician's visionary imagination. The underlying unity of the divinely human spirit then discloses itself through this equilibrium. In the following part, we'll explore more deeply how the symbolism of the hexagram represents these themes. Love is the law, love under will.